This is Skeptic with another design video, not a balance video, so get out if you want that. But I'm going to try to focus on the more visual and like cool side of things because I think StarCraft 2 is in a bit of a do or die moment. We need to appeal to people that have new blood. We need to appeal to the casual players. And that's what this change is obviously aimed at. It might be a little bit too extreme. It hasn't quite been dialed in perfectly, but it's a good proof of concept. I think it'd be really cool to fulfill the Zerg swarmy aesthetic by allowing larva, as the larva count increases, to sort of spread out further around the hatchery. Obviously, ideally keeping the initial larva still at the bottom, just to keep things consistent. These kind of fantasy changes are awesome. You know what isn't awesome? I think this would make watching large tech switches and extreme late-game remaxing a lot more visually exciting. I always thought of the blue fire that appeared on Protoss structures in Brood War as being extremely iconic. Like, it's something that I really remember as being a graphical design choice. Maybe it's controversial, but maybe we should consider bringing that back. Blizzard's primary concern was about gameplay and intuitiveness. They were concerned that if Protoss fire was there, it might confuse players into thinking that their structure was burning down, because that's how Terran burning works. And so if there's fire on both structures but only one loses health very slowly over time, it can be hard to tell that difference. But I don't know, man. I think the blue fire just adds an element of coolness to Protoss structures, and I think the visuals are impactful, so I don't know. You'd have to tell me what you think about this one, because it's been on my mind for quite a while. I would like to note that if we did opt to return the fire to the game, it might look a little bit better than what you see here, simply because this is sort of a mock-up, and it's like missing transition states and stuff. I was just sort of kind of to get a general idea of what it would look like. Another possibility I came across for a visual update is that in Legacy of the Void, Blizzard added a new area of effect indicator for Protoss, and they added it to the campaign, but for some reason it wasn't pushed to multiplayer, and it just kind of looks better than the existing one. So if possible, I think we should just update that, and it's also a very easy change. Something else I noticed is that the Disruptor does not have an AOE indicator, and this is probably just a bug / oversight. It doesn't even show it if you hover over the button. The next one will take too long to explain, so I just won't. But basically, Mothership Cloak and Guardian Shield have no range indicators, because no existing standards really work for them. The Guardian Shield is not too bad. It does say the range on the ability tooltip, and it also, when you pop Guardian Shield, you can see its range extremely clearly. It has great visual feedback. But the Cloak actually doesn't. I mean, the Cloak, there's no indication of the range. You basically just have to walk a unit inside and outside and watch it cloak and uncloak until you can figure out what the range is on your own. It's absolutely terrible. If we really don't want to do a standard, we could just use the existing sort of range indicator thing. It's the same amount of difficulty to do. The world's your oyster. Just add something. The Reaper suffers from a similar problem of not having an AoE indicator on the KD8 grenade. This one I don't think is a bug or an oversight. This was intentional, but it was the consequence of a bad design decision that's unrelated. This is how you would expect KD8 charges to work, as it's a very precise ability because you're bouncing your target to specific places, but it doesn't actually work this way. In the live game, it snaps the target location to the closest side of the unit that you clicked on. So you can't click on the opposite side of a stalker to bounce it towards you, because that will place the grenade at the front of the stalker and bounce the stalker away from you. So if you've ever felt like your KD8 charges are doing something weird, they're not obeying your orders, that's what this is. And the reason this messes with the possibility of an AoE indicator is because every time you try to throw it at a unit, it's just lying to you about where you're going to try to place the KD8. I like the combination of these two fixes because it makes things more precise at the high level, but it also makes things more understandable at the lower level. While something like an AoE indicator is good game design and might keep around a player who would otherwise have had a bad experience, causing them to leave, what it doesn't do is become cool. No new player looks at a change like this and goes, wow, that's cool. I want to play more of that. That's my favorite unit. Something Blizzard really nailed at the start of StarCraft 2 was making sure that every unit had a clear fantasy role. You went, what is that unit? That's the jetpack unit. And the Reaper does a really great example of this in a live game. The Reaper, if you look, its model is slightly off the ground, and when it turns, it actually sort of like its whole body shifts because it's in the air, not grounded, it's not anchored to the ground. So it rotates its body like a medevac or an air unit when it turns. Except I lied. I just lied to you. It doesn't lift itself off the ground very far. It doesn't rotate its body when it turns. No, in the live game, it looks like it's touching the ground. It looks like it's dragging its feet all over the face of the earth. Similar to like when your mom's over and I'm dragging my... joking, but in all seriousness, we can safe value to lift it off the ground at 0.15. We can go a little bit further maybe, but the safe values there. Also, just add a very, very small banker to it. But that's still not cool! Guys, this is not cool. Nobody cares about this. People that want to innovate and try new strategies, this is not what they want to hear. They want some cool ability. Like, for instance, we don't have an LOS ability in the game. What if the Reaper had an upgrade on the Tech Lab locked behind the Ghost Academy that upgraded the KD8 to emit a 3x3 LOS blocker as a gas field that reduces the vision range of enemy units inside of it to 0? A utility-based ability. And you know what? The Reaper, he's got a gas mask on, he's got a jetpack, make it cooler. How about this? The Reaper can suicide himself by detonating his jetpack if he's standing inside the zone to blow up the LOS field. That's cool. If unpolished, it's rushed it out, but it's a cool idea. It certainly gives the Reaper some survivability after Ling Speed and Blink and stuff are out, even if it isn't just buffing the Reaper's speed directly. I do want to go back to the banker thing, though, because the Hellion does have a similar problem. It has, like, 4 wheels, so when it turns, it's like the wheels have to move perpendicular to where the tire would actually pull the vehicle. And I think this is why it's felt always very stiff to me, and I think the Cyclone actually has the same problem to a lesser degree. They just need to bank a tiny degree to make it look like it's sort of leaning into the turn. I just want to clarify as well, this is purely visual. Banking is just an actor, so it doesn't have any impact on how the unit actually moves. It's just how it looks like it's moving. I know this seems like so tiny, but these sort of like visual feely changes don't just make things look nicer for new players, but they actually make the game feel fresher for old players. Because if you play the game long enough, you become so ridiculously familiar with the animations that you don't even get that quick dopamine boost from something unexpected happening in the way the unit's moving visually. And you don't have to do the whole balancing debate and backlash. Last patch's Hydralisk move speed animation was a great example. And it's why I keep harping on and on about the Hellion's turret not visually tracking, even if it's only the visual change implementation. And you know what? I'm just gonna say it! The Thor should be bigger! I don't care if you broke your elbow! These units are the selling points of an RTS. These are the things that people want to play with. That's why they pick it up. I don't care if the top of ladder, it makes it more difficult to control. Make the damn thing bigger. Bring it on, Reddit. It's too late to turn it into a Goliath. Gold Leaguers are not losing because the Thor is getting stuck on other units. It's not happening. Make it do at least the one thing it can do actually well, which is look cool. Give it push priority. Give the tank push priority so that it doesn't move the tank around in weird ways and so that Bio can filter past the tank. And just leave the Thor big. Make it cool. Make it cool again. Last patch it was fixed. Its Javelin attack had no animation. It now has an animation. This patch, it currently actually has no sound on the high impact attack, so I have added one here. And that should be added to make it sound cooler. It feels like to make any unit stat change to make a unit cooler is like pulling teeth. Like we just solve balance problems these days. Riddle me this, for instance. Units we want to feel different from each other, which means their stats have to differ from each other. So like for instance, some units we want to have a high turn rate versus others turn slower, but you can't make too many units have low turn rate because that doesn't feel good to control, which means you have to put them on units that, you're not microing a lot. So riddle me this, why does the Overlord have a high turn rate? Why? Where are the stat changes where we're just saying, maybe we could just tweak this unit a little bit to fit its iconic status as a slow-ass literal space cow? Check the turn before moving fight. Just slash half its turn rate. Give it 1/40th of its current lateral acceleration. Just try to fulfill the fantasy. Just a minor visual nitpick on the Swarmhost, particularly the Locust. When Locusts spawn, they all spawn at the same time, and somebody, I guess, just didn't check the flag that randomly staggers the move animation, so the Locusts all fly in perfect sync, which is not very swarmy, not very Zerg, and it feels really dumb. So if you ever felt like something was off, this is it. Quick, easy fix. It's nice. Another problem with Swarmhost control is that Locusts spawn directly over top of the Swarmhost, which means if you try to box your new Locusts, you'll end up boxing the Swarmhosts too, and they have a higher priority, which means you won't be able to cast the swoop ability with your new Locusts. So here you can see if I have both the Locusts and the Swarmhost selected, the Swarmhost actually does allow the swoop ability to be cast. In fact, since recording this, I've actually realized it's probably even smarter to allow the Swarmhost to spawn Locusts while Locusts are selected as well. They're basically a 2-in-1 unit. In fact, if the ground Locust is the active subselection and the only other unit in the subselection is a flying Locust, you still can't swoop. Why? This clip is actually showing something different though. Another problem with Locust control I have is that Locusts that have already started their swoop will still be selected if you control click the remaining flying ones. So if you try to like split them to 2 different locations, you tell half to swoop, and then you control click the flying Locust to send them somewhere else, you'll also select the ones that are already swooping. It feels especially bad because even though the Locusts mid-swoop are selectable, they can't be issued orders, so sometimes they'll get the orders that the flying Locusts are given, but sometimes they're mid-swoop and they'll miss the orders. It just feels random. This is an easy fix. There is an existing checkbox that would allow you to disable the selection for Locusts that are currently mid-swoop. Something that makes me angry about the spawn larva injectability is that the one that you see visually currently active on the hatchery could be the only one, or there could be an additional 65,534 active and you would have no idea. Quite a big jump there, so I think it would be great if we could just add a little, like in brackets, a number. If you hover over the green icon in the bottom middle left of the screen, this sort of indicates that a hatch has been injected. You just add a counter there, and there's really no downside to that. So something you'll notice about the siege tanks here is that when I issue an order to unsiege, I can then very immediately queue in order to re-siege, and the tank will sort of automatically queue that up and do the unsiege or the re-siege after it's done its current one. I'm not hitting shift here. Zerg is missing something like this, I think, on the Queen spawn larva ability. In-game, if you try to inject and then you recast inject while it's already injecting, the Queen just sort of loses the order. And I think this just kind of penalizes lower level Zergs for no real reason. If they issue another click, it should probably just queue it up, if done fast enough. Okay, this one's highly controversial because it produces inconsistent behavior, but I think it does so for the benefit of lower level players at the expense of the highest level. Not all Zerg players are Serral, and the lower level Zerg players generally suffer from this thing called Queen Shuffling. And Queen Shuffling is when you have multiple Queens spread across multiple bases in the same control group, and where you shift click to try to inject larvae into the hatcheries. What this essentially causes due to poor spark cast behavior is a Queen at base 1 move into base 2 to inject, and a Queen at base 2 move into base 1 to inject. It's really inefficient, and it's super stupid. The Queens basically just end up running all over the place without any rhyme or reason, and it's very hard to even tell what's going on to correct it as a low-level player. The way that this solution works, and the reason it's so controversial, is that we are trying to find the cases where we know that you probably aren't going to want to actually drag Queen from base to base and eliminate that possibility of being cast. So what are these cases? Well, first consider that a Queen regenerating energy will reach 25 energy for an inject exactly at the time that its previous inject will expire. This means if there's a Queen already near the hatchery, it is always going to be able to inject at least once to keep the hatchery running. Now, obviously, you wouldn't want to make it so that a Queen couldn't inject a hatchery that had another Queen nearby within range, because, well, like, what if they were both in range of the same hatchery? However, that option becomes a lot more reasonable if you first make a check to see if the Queen is further than like 30 range away from the hatchery. The odds that you want to pull a Queen 30 range away without a move command to inject a hatchery that already has a Queen right next to it is low. Keep in mind, you would still be able to cast Inject at long range, assuming there was no Queen already at the hatchery. So you would still be able to distribute your Queens to the bases using Spawn Inject on the map, for instance. I don't want to spend too much more time on this and get bogged down in it, but I implore you to think long and hard about it. It's definitely a solution that introduces inconsistent behavior, but it could be worth it because it really does limit Queen shuffling. They stay at their current base more often, and when they do shuffle to another base, they will only move like one base maximum away. Again, this is aimed at the casuals, which means if you're watching this video, it's probably not aimed at you, and yet you might be wanting to support it anyway if it's a good idea. So what you're observing here is something that's bugged me for quite a while, and it's that the Lurker's spines don't really accurately visually represent where the damage is actually being dealt. And the reason for this is the thing that triggers the spine to appear visually is after the damage has already been done, and it takes a long time for the spike to raise out of the ground and then go back down. So there's times where the damage will hit far before the spike comes up, and the damage will not hit when the spike is very clearly on the unit because it hasn't disappeared fast enough. So the solution is just to speed up the visuals of when the spike comes up and goes down. Additionally, most attacks generate a visual effect when they hit their target. So for instance, the Marine generates a little ricochet effect, the Stalker particle disruptors explode in a blue ball. The Lurkers is very small, and it appears at the unit's feet, so it spawns inside the unit it hits a lot of the time, so you can't really tell. So by scaling it up and moving it upwards on the model, it's able to be more easily seen and tell which units have been hit by the attack if they don't die. I'd recommend replaying that section on a slower speed. Can anyone explain to me why the Hellbat looks like it's been smushed like a pancake? Like, it's not very tall at all, even though it's like a lumbering mech that a Marine's supposed to be inside of. I'm pretty sure that there's actually, like, they call it a penguin build when you have like a Hellbat Viking build. Like, it looks like a penguin. Like, it looks stupid. Do you know what units are not supposed to look? Stupid. They're supposed to look cool. We need to just stretch the model out vertically a little more, and it starts to look a little more intimidating against units like Zerglings. Another problem is with the Hellbat walk animation speed. In the last patch, we adjusted the Hydralisk walk animation move speed, which I think was a success, made it look a little bit more slithery. The problem with the Hellbat is that it walks at the same, if not faster speed than a Marine. And it's just, that's not how it's supposed to be. It's clearly a more lumbering unit. It's supposed to be slower, it looks bigger. The strides it takes should be longer. Then I've got some other visual nitpicks. There is currently a bug on the Siegetank attack impact animation fire that causes units that when they're picked up, the blast craters and fire to sort of disappear or appear in weird places. And while we're talking about it, this fire that exists on units after they've been hit by the tank fire in order to indicate they've been affected by the splash damage portion should also probably be reused as an asset on the Ravager. Right now, the Ravager is corrosive Bile, despite being like a fireball. It doesn't actually leave fire behind on the units it hits, which is especially a problem when the Ravager is targeting air units, because besides the health going down, there's really no indication that the air units have actually been hit by a corrosive Bile. And then obviously there's the less impactful case, but it still does make it a little bit more readable when ground units are hit by the Bile. This can be implemented in a way that fixes another small issue, which is that Biles don't explode until they hit the ground, so with large structures like command centers, they'll just phase through, and there's not a huge indication that the command center was actually hit, so we just add some fire on top to make that more apparent. Another small visual issue with Ravagers is that if they are moving when they cast Corrosive Bile, their legs will lock up at the moment of cast, and they'll just glide along the ground like a hovercraft for a second or so, and that can be reduced slightly. Okay, this is a hill I'm going to die on, and if you disagree with this, frankly, I think you need to go and touch some grass because you've been playing this game too long, and you've lost all perspective. There is no reason why Stim should have a cooldown of 0 seconds. You still want to be able to pop a Stim early in order to extend the duration, but for a 0 cooldown, you are literally just inviting the player to fat finger Stim twice for no frickin' reason. Okay, this should not be possible. You had a 1 second cooldown and this problem goes away. And yes, does it also make micro a little easier? Of course, but I don't care. And if you do, you're a bad person. Last patch, the Balance Council tried to help map makers out. Liberators are incredibly abusive and they really skew map design, in particular around mineral lines, because they're able to hang out in a dead space where ground units cannot deflect them because they have such a large range, particularly after advanced ballistics. And so my preferred solution for dealing with this wasn't their approach. It would be to remove the automatic revealing of their circle, so that you have to bring a second unit or you have to scan, similar to the way that a Siege Tank or a Tempest don't have vision of their maximum range. They need, supporting units. And there's always opportunities to adjust the sound of units to give them a fresh coat of paint, like I did there. Speaking of map making, one stabilizing force to the ZVZ matchup on ladder is giving Zerg players the potential to wall off certain entrances from Ling Floods, particularly relevant at the natural base opening and sometimes near the main. The problem is that for Zerg to wall, they have to have creep at the location, and oftentimes the walls that you need are simply not capable of being constructed in time, since it takes so long to get the initial creep tumor out and for it to spread. And that's without mentioning losing the energy that might be essential for an inject or even a transfuse. It's actually quite difficult to get the center of bases between minerals and gas where the hatcheries go to be close enough to the areas where you actually need to wall with the creep. Last patch, the council tried to help out map makers by increasing the range at which hatcheries spread creep, and so increasing the hatchery creep radius just by 1, while appreciated, it was sort of a band-aid. It helped us out, but it didn't actually address the core problem, and obviously only 1 additional range is not going to be game-changing. In a lot of situations, having the hatchery be closer to where you want to wall is a map maker skish you. However, some aren't. There are some fundamental layout restrictions because of this. For instance, in this example, the Siegetank simply will hit the mineral fields if I move the hatchery any further south towards the main ramp. This is a totally contrived example, but you get the point. So my radical proposal is allowing mapmakers to extend creep when generated in a certain area a few blocks farther than usual. There might be a little bit more work to be done in order to try to come up with a standard for how to visually communicate which areas are considered creep extension. Maybe little purple rocks or something, but you get the point. We could even then revert the hatchery creep radius change. Okay, let's talk about Terran thematic changes. First of all, Salvage in its current form is horrible. Okay, there's no visual or auditory feedback. There's just this random line that appears, and when the line runs out, the building explodes. Like, the player will just have no idea what happens if it's the opponent's building that starts to salvage until it happens, and even then they'll be like, why did the building blow up? I threw this together in 5 seconds, but something like this would be great. Blizzard had this cool thematic idea for Terran where they would be able to pick up their base and move it elsewhere. But even in scenarios where this should be optimal for Terran, such as on a 4-player map where there is an alternative main base you can take in another corner, we never see it. And the reason, partially, is because it's just not practical, as you have to leave behind a lot of your critical infrastructure such as supply depots and add-ons. It's a map-making problem that Terran gets trapped in their quadrant, with the distance between their production and the area they're trying to defend growing larger and larger. Frankly, the council adding Salvage to the sensor tower seems much less interesting to me than adding it to add-ons, because that could even create new and interesting ways of constructing build orders. Obviously, add-ons with the structure attached wouldn't be able to salvage. Allowing supply depots to salvage is not a good idea, because it messes with the supply curve in strange ways. But what we could do to make depots more relocatable is allow them to use the call down ability to essentially move the 8 supply from the normal depot over to another location. That means you'd only have to build half the depots you currently have at your new location, and you'd be able to transfer the rest over. Ignore the lack of polish, I was rushed to get it done. Also just want to comment that this would be a much better adjustment to the call down ability, I think, than what the council did with the health thing that nobody uses, nobody likes, and is really not great design if you ask me. Also, something else I want you to pay attention to here is when I try to place the add-ons, the barracks will queue to multiple different locations. This is another fix that we should be implementing. Right now, if you try to land without an add-on with multiple barracks, you're able to do it, but with add-on placement, like, it'll just keep updating the same barracks. It's really annoying. There's also the possibility of stealing Stormgate's idea and nerfing Terran flying structures' base speed in exchange for allowing them to ramp up their speed over long distances. The changes made to the sensor tower in 5.0.14 sort of miss the point. I think we should experiment with re-increasing the sensor tower's range, but putting it on a pulse timer. The primary purpose of the sensor tower is to essentially replace creep or warpins for Terran, since they have a harder time rotating. So if they have a little bit more of a warning, they can rotate in time. When the range gets too large, the sensor tower gets too strong. And I think people miss the point that even though you can't see the units and they only appear as a blip, you don't actually really need the information on what units you're looking at a lot of the time. Just the fact that you can see the army movement, particularly see if they're air or ground, dependent on the way that they're moving, the way that they're pathing, tells you all you need to know. And there's some fun conversations about how you would implement a pulse. For instance, can you build more than one sensor tower to increase the pulse rate, or are they all at the same time? I think this is a much more fun and useful avenue to explore. Here you'll see me having to shift and then spam left click a whole bunch in order to get the caustic spray ability going. I was actually in the editor, so funnily enough, I don't have access to rapid fire here, so this was kind of awful. Anytime we have the opportunity to move a spell away from being dependent on rapid fire for optimal use, we should take it. Obviously, you can't always do that, such as in the case of Ghost Knight, because it affects the balance. In any case that you try to remove rapid fire, you are just by nature going to be disrupting the very top of ladder compared to those below them. However, I think that in the case of the Viper and the Corruptor, we have a good example of 2 different spells that could remove the best unit tag. What essentially this does is when you cast the ability, all of the units in your selection will go and queue that order up. It really just saves a lot of unnecessary clicks, and the impact of that is like exponentially affecting the lower end. I mean, the lowest end of ladder literally just can't use these spells because they don't have the clicks per second to use them, which is really unfortunate because you want players to engage with the available content. You want them to play with the stuff that they have. I also just wanted to make a note while we're discussing it that, in fact, the caustic spray this patch has an animation that we did not have last patch, which is nice. I would like to see more of these kinds of changes.
This is size storm. It needs to be exactly the size and shape of the area effect it's going to do.
Look at what they did to my boy, Dustin Browder. They did him dirty. This is a super hot take, But I actually think that the community thinks that Psystorm is way stronger than it actually is, and that's in part because people aren't properly splitting against it. Particularly because they feel like even if they do move their unit, that they can't move it outside of the storm fast enough. For instance, Hydralisks with their slow movement speed. You feel like it's not even worth trying. Now actually, what you're witnessing here in my proposed fix still doesn't have Psystorm's visuals perfectly aligning with its actual damage radius. If you actually did reduce Psystorm to its like proper values, it would look really underwhelming, to say the least. So I've done my best to really hunker down and try to find the exact point at which it's close enough without losing the sort of wow appeal of the visuals. It's too late in the game's life cycles to nerf the hell out of something so iconic as Psystorm's visuals. And there's also some tricks. You'll notice that a purple tiny storm appears on units that are hit by Psystorm's damage. In my opinion, an existing problem is that this storm does not scale properly with unit sizes large enough, so it often spawns inside of the model of units that it's affecting, especially if they're standing still. And so increasing the size of this purple storm can increase the visual feedback, but also can just be used to compensate for the less cool, smaller storm itself. This impacts air units a lot because they're not actually inside the storm, and so this impact is really your only indication they're being affected. Another issue with the visual sizing of models related to the Templar are simply its projectile and impact attack models for its weapon. Generally speaking, you want weapons that deal a lot of damage to have big explosions and big projectiles, and ones that do little amounts of damage be very small, right? And this is part of helping the player visually digest things. In the case of the Templar's attack is the equivalent of a worker's attack. Like, literally it deals like no damage, and so the size of the attack needs to be scaled down to reflect that. If you did not know any better, if you weren't familiar with the concept of like the water balloons, you would think that the Templar was actually dealing a lot of damage, especially because it does so much damage when you store. And I'm just going to keep ranting about this one till the end of time. I still don't really understand why nobody's done anything to address the fact that High Templar's weapons pull them into conflicts that like they should never be pulled into, because the weapon is not actually intended to ever win a fight. It literally deals negative damage. There's no point. So I'm sure, you know, my previous recommendation of trying to change the acquire mode from offensive to defensive, maybe that's a step too far, but we can definitely reduce the acquired movement limit, or you know, it'll literally at the smallest case reduce the scan range. Like, just please, anything. Maybe I'm the only person to ever have noticed this one, but it kind of annoys me, and I think it's become more relevant as StarCraft has become more about harassment than it used to be. But when you try to like stutter step around a mineral line, if you attack move and the cursor is placed over top of a mineral field or a geyser, because they're invulnerable units, the attack move will fail, which obviously can really mess up your micro. So I think it could be an interesting idea to just, you know, allow the attack moves to disregard the invulnerable units. The Mutalisk is, I think, one of the units that people most like to watch, and yet it's also one of the units that has fallen by the wayside, and it hasn't changed, like, since Heart of the Swarm or something. Like, it's an old, tired unit that could use a facelift. There's a couple different approaches. The most basic, tiny balance thing I think you could do is increase its arc slot. And what this does is it means that when you try to dart in and out with a Mutalisk, if the Mutalisk is facing away from the target, it will be able to fire the shot faster without having it be cancelled when you try to turn it back around again. You know, if you ask me, you could probably get more ambitious on the balance side of things and, like, give it +1 base armor and then just negate that plus armor for certain units, like increasing Spore and Phoenix damage versus Light by 1. And then just nerf its health by 5 or something to compensate. I think, like, the lowest form of thinking about unit control, you think about, like, you know, health, speed, range. The next level down, you start looking at things like turn rate and, you know, maybe, like, damage point. And then at the bottom, you've got stuff like range and arc slop. You've got stuff like the acceleration and the deceleration. I don't know, I think there's a lot of room to play with the Muta. And these lower level things, I think they get forgotten about and should be looked at more. Like the Mutalisk, people look at it and they just go, oh, the damage point is low, so like that's the best we can do, Chief. But honestly, that's not even that interesting. You know, if you're going to make a thematic change without radically changing the unit, I think I would probably just modify its health regeneration to be more interesting. So instead of just having faster regeneration on other Zerg units, which is kind of like, I mean, boring. It might be cool if it was like it regenerates faster the lower health that it is. So, you know, pulling back those weakened Mutalisks would actually be very rewarding because you could rapidly heal them up. Whereas damage dealt on mutas that were otherwise full health actually does somewhat chip away at it and prepare it for splash damage. I don't know, I really just want to see more mutas skirmishing on the front lines without fearing like a stray marine mullet just absolutely killing it. One thing I love about the Warp Prism is its deceleration value is pretty low, which means it has a lot of momentum when you try to stop it. So you hit stop and it just keeps on going. I love it. However, this does have a downside, which is that if you try to like chain pickups, or just in general when you're trying to control units, the War Prism will decelerate while approaching the unit it's supposed to pick up, which really slows the whole interaction down. It feels really terrible. The most annoying part is just the inconsistency. Like, if it's within range, just exactly on the line, it's instant, but if it's like 0.025 outside of range, you're dealing with deceleration, which is just, it's not fun. So as you can see here, I've just sort of jury-rigged a way to keep the acceleration when it's, you know, just regular coming to a stop or whatever. But when it's picking up, it will keep its acceleration values at something of a more microable level. And then I'll just say it again, I've said it before, but the dropship should all have a pickup nearby button. I mean, it's 2025. Pull yourself together. Let's play a fun little game. Tell me why these two fights end differently. And no, it doesn't have to do with target fire or concaves. It's not just you just actually can't see the fact that Guardian Shield has been affecting this whole fight. There's a whole bunch of visual radius issues of different models and spells in the game, ranging from Guardian Shield to Parasitic Bomb to Microbial Shroud, anything basically that has like an area of effect radius. Likely suffers from some kind of pop-in issue. In this case, Guardian Shield is not visible until the sentry is visible, rather than being visible when you can see the Guardian Shield itself. Parasitic Bomb, for instance, has the exact opposite problem of Guardian Shield, where it's just visible in the fog of war the whole time. When Protoss shields get hit by attacks, they react in different ways depending on what the attack is. In the case of EFP, it's configured incorrectly, and so you'll see that the shield is like on the wrong side from where the EMP actually lands, and it's actually a smaller reaction as well. There are additional instances of this, such as the Reaper's KD8 charge not causing shields to react properly, as well as the Disruptor's Purification Nova and the Ravager's Corrosive Bile. Speaking of the Reaper's KD8 charge again, you might have noticed that sometimes when units are close enough to the explosion, but they don't get knocked anywhere because of like a wall or another unit or something, they still actually play the animation as though they've been knocked back, so thanks to Nollerton for that one. Something that makes me like irrationally angry is the range indicator for shield battery overcharge. Because ever since the Nexus has had this range indicator on it, like it's just made Protoss bases look so ugly all the time because it has to be displayed all the time due to a sort of weird engine bug / quirk thing that we can't really fix. But there are things we can do to mitigate how often we have to display this range radius. For instance, if you've already cast it and it's on cooldown, there's no need to keep it around. Something else that makes me angry is that Chrono Boost has no cooldown and is local to the Nexus in terms of like energy or whatever. There is literally no indication that recall or energy overcharge are a global cooldown based ability. Like, this is just not a thing that's communicated. And also with the range actors, like there's no communication that one Nexus can cast within the range of another Nexus. So like this whole thing, I hate the whole thing so much. It just makes me so angry. The way I've come up with to delineate that Chrono Boost is different from Recall and Energy Recharge in terms of global ability is giving a charge counter to Recall and Energy Recharge. If you had a local charge-based ability, when you selected two Nexus, if they each had one charge, it would show as two charges. In this case, if you select two Nexus and they still only have one charge, that's how you know it's global. So that's a good fix there. Similar to when I was talking about the idle refinery fix from last patch, and I said it's going to need a lot of testing, and even then we missed the grace period on the probe thing. These fall into the same category. So there's three things I want to do. One, I want to make it so that drones that are attacking a constructing XCV lose their order less often, so they'll actually follow it around to the different sides of the command center. I also want SCVs to be able to queue up on a structure that's already building. So right now, if a probe's attacking your SCV gets low, you have to pull off the existing builder and then put on a new one. You can't put on a new builder and then take the existing one off. And this comes into play when you're playing against oracles, for instance, with missile turrets, and you do this dumb interaction where you just have to right-click the missile turret a billion times, and this would fix that. And then something not exclusive to SCVs, and something that very much complicates when you combine these two. So again, take this with a grain of salt, see if I can even do it. It's quite difficult. Ideally, I would like to help new players out by making it so that if you tell workers to right-click a Vespene Geyser that doesn't have a refinery, and a refinery gets built on that Vespene Geyser, the order will be rerouted from the Vespene Geyser that no longer exists to the refinery. And then I have honorable mention ideas. I think probes should be able to fake harvest while hallucinated, but not return trip to the Nexus, if that makes sense. They just sit on the patch infinitely while mining. I think it would be cool to fix the Oracle bug. It would be cool to fix, the Sentry and the Void Ray too, that's the same bug. There's an Adept bug that still hasn't been fixed. The Cyclone is currently shooting, I think, 33% faster than normal or something crazy like that, although that's unconfirmed, but there's other Mothership bugs, lots of stuff. I'm sure I'll get to it at some point. And then just as a final note, TLMC 20 of the 92 maps that passed the initial quality assurance screening, these 2 maps of mine managed to get 90th place and 91st place, so like second and third worst. So no one's ever going to play them if I don't, like, basically beg. So please, somebody play them. There was a lot of time spent on them. They're not perfect. The bottom one is very wacky, and you will die a billion times trying to learn how to play on it. Gukden's a little more reasonable, but yeah. Anyway, this was OmniSkeptic signing off.